That's an interesting theory, and there's some incense also, that was burned in the Holy of Holies at the time of the high priest experiencing the greatest possible closeness to God at the time. There's been quite a bit of speculation about the nature of that incense as well.
Maybe that's why they tied a rope around his ankle before he went in case he passed out, just pull him on out.
Well, that very well could be. Yeah, if it was an extremely, psychoactive kind of incense. But the whole existence of, naturally occurring hallucinogens in our brains, well, that kind of dispenses with the need, to look for an external, source of, psychedelic experience. If, we've got DMT and, 5-methoxy-DMT and I would imagine all other kinds of undiscovered compounds, in our brain, circulating. If, for whatever, reason, those can be stimulated or are stimulated, they could produce the, same kinds of effects, without necessarily resorting to an external source.
This might be a little bit off the topic, but what do you think fluoride can do as far as calcifying the pineal gland or calcifying parts of your brain that would create these compounds? Do you think fluoride does bad things to it?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, the whole fluoride and pineal thing is pretty complicated. I really have not read all that much about the pineal fluoride connection. Although every month or two, somebody asks me about the fluoride pineal thing. I think what has been established is that fluoride does speed up the calcification of the pineal gland, which occurs naturally over time anyway. But whether or not the abnormal or premature calcification of the pineal gland has any impact on consciousness, that would kind of hinge on is there any relationship between the pineal gland and consciousness in the first place. And I think it's safe to say that the jury is still out in that regard. We just don't know if there is DMT in the pineal or any other psychoactive compounds in the pineal.
Well, oddly enough, if I'm correct, the Buddhists believe that the pineal gland forms at 49 days?
49 days.
Yes.
And yeah, that's it. Well, they believe that the soul is reincarnated at 49 days.
Yes, that's it. And
the
pineal gland forms at 49 days.
Yeah. Well, that's a fact. Yeah. That in the human embryo, that's when the pineal gland forms. Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's just another thing that shows us that things that people think are just a spiritual or religious thing, they really do coincide with things that are actually physiologically happening. I believe Descartes, is that what his name was right. It is the seat of the soul. That's just what I believe. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Well, it makes some sense. It's intuitively appealing, but still you have to, kind of differentiate, between a, coincidence and causality. All because they occur at the same time doesn't necessarily mean that they're related. All that they could be.
And just if we can go back to your new book, because I'm really I had a couple of religious questions, but I was like, no, I don't want to ask him. He's a scientist, and it's amazing to see you writing on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the specific topics that you're going to point out in your book? Well,
yeah, I'm kind of knee deep in the book right now, so it's still hard to stand too far back. Getting a perspective on it. But what will I be talking about? Well, let me see. I might have the table of contents over here. Yeah, there'll be maybe 12 chapters or so. I'll first kind of start off in describing my personal background in terms of, my interest in starting the DMT work, and, then I'll, describe the DMT work. And then I'll, describe, the main questions that I was left with after completing the DMT studies, which I suppose, could be summarized by the question, where is this? Where is this state, or, where is this level of reality that people seem to enter into through the aid of DMT? So then I'll, be describing the models that I use to understand the location and the nature of the DMT realms. And I'll give some background into how I ended up, reading the Old Testament, and, my understanding of, the Hebrew language and my understanding of Scripture and those kinds of things. If you're going to be speaking about the Old Testament, and if you're going to be speaking about, the prophets and, the prophetic state of consciousness, you kind of have to talk about God, because God plays a huge role in Scripture, obviously. So I'll describe, my understanding of God, how it began and, where it, kind of developed over the years. And, then I'll start to speak about prophecy and, describe, the prophetic state, kind of in almost a clinical manner. I'll, be kind of pulling the words of, the biblical, prophets in order to support contention that there is a specific kind of state of consciousness, which we can call, the prophetic state. It's emotional and it's visual, somatic effects, cognitive effects, those kinds of things. The same, kind of way that I describe the DMT state. It's, visual and emotional and, somatic effects, those kinds of things. And then I'll discuss some of the theories that have been developed over the millennia, for prophecy. I'll spend some time describing, some of the, medieval commentators out there who spent a lot of time and spilt a lot of ink describing prophecy and, coming up with very scientific theories about how it worked. So then I'll go through the centuries of speculation about what is the nature of the prophetic state up until the present day, with all of the brain chemistry and, the brain imaging studies going on there with respect, to what goes on biologically during a spiritual experience. So then I'll start to explicate what is the prophetic message, what is the content of the message, what's the information that the prophets were able to, kind of bring back in that state. What is the message? The ethical message, the spiritual message, the poetry, the legal messages, all those kinds of things. And I'll also be speaking about what they call the false prophets. What's the difference, between a so-called true prophet as compared to a so-called false prophet? And oftentimes it's extremely difficult to distinguish between the two. And one of the messages of the prophets is that of the Messiah. So I'll kind of riff off on the concept of the Messiah somewhat as well. So then I'll conclude by stating, that prophecy is our, biological birthright. If it's built in, to the system, we ought to be learning more about it. Instead of getting high with the psychedelics, we can attain prophecy, or, kind of approach prophecy anyway. And, if all of Scripture is, written as a result of, the prophetic state, if you want to really understand the prophetic message, it, could be advisable to experience, the prophetic state to understand the message at a more deep level. And, some ways I'm going to be encouraging, people who study Scripture a lot, even, the right-wing, fundamentalist, types out there, that if they really, want to understand Scripture, why not enter the state in which Scripture was written, which is a psychedelic state?
They refer to that as sorcery, though, don't they?
Well, I suppose they could, and I'm going to be encountering a fair bit of resistance, from all camps, I think. But there is sorcery, and there is prophecy, and you have to be able to to distinguish between the two.
I can't wait to read this book. I'm excited just hearing you talk about it, because I know that a lot of people that are fundamentalist Christians, before they use DMT, are still fundamentalist Christians after they use DMT, but they have a much broader understanding of Scripture.
Well, so there are